All right, everyone, we are back live, back to back, Dynasty Mirror Search for Huru. And I have the Professor Davis with us again today. And we're going to discuss why African immigrants need to thank Booker T. Washington in regards to his contributions to Africa. And more importantly, why a lot of the work that Booker T. Washington did as far as the foundation he laid made it possible for African immigrants to immigrate to America. And the reason why I want to speak on this is because I don't think a lot of Africans know the impact that Booker T. Washington had on them. So we have the expert, Professor Davis, to come on and take some time out of his day to go into the nook and crannies and go into detail about what Booker T. Washington did and how his impact and his influence helped out the continent and also those Africans who are now here in America. Is that fair?
Well, I'll say that I'm not an expert in the
area. Your mic is acting up.
Hold on a second. Let me turn it down just a little bit. Is that better?
Yeah, that's better. It's just it was distorted, but it's fine now. But go ahead.
Okay. Well, I'm actually not an expert in the area of Booker T. Washington at all. However, I do know, and I will say this: he has been a major figure in U.S. history. He went to slavery in Virginia and Franklin County, man, in the 18. I believe it was the 18.
But Professor Davis, not to cut you off, but it's doing it again. I don't know if where your phone is. If it's like rubbing on your shirt or
can you hear me now?
Yeah, I hear you now. That's fine. That's better.
Okay. I apologize about that. Is that matter of fact, I'm holding my phone, so perhaps maybe I had it laying down and that was an issue.
Okay. Yeah,
but
you're good.
But as I was stating, I'm not an expert, and I'm going to defer and I'm going to reference from Dr. Tyreen Wright a lot, and she has a book about Washington, and it's speaking of him becoming a budding Pan-Africanist. But Washington in the latter part of the 1800s and also the beginning of the 19th century was the most powerful African American in the United States. He was born into slavery in the state of Virginia, Franklin County. But over time, he was able to move beyond that, go to Hampton University, and eventually establish Tuskegee University, which is a major institution in the United States. Booker T. Washington was an exceptional person. Now, he's often viewed as an accommodationist, but people tend not to understand that, how, again, African Americans are anchored in the country. I mean, we have been historically and are a minority, and so we have to work within a country that has not come to terms with its, if you will, indigenous Black population, meaning Black Americans. Now, let me just say this, and more specifically in regards to the African exclusionary measures. The Panama Canal was complete in 1914, and the vast majority of workers or laborers who were used to build the canal primarily came from the West Indies or Blacks from Central and South America. And after the canal was complete, there were some, specifically whites, in the U.S. government felt that those immigrants, those Black immigrants, were going to try to come to the United States or immigrate to the United States. So the U.S. government or politicians, elected officials, basically made an amendment to our immigration laws in 1914, which excluded any Black person coming from Central, South America, the Caribbean, so on and so forth. And this was in 1914, of course. And also it extended for Africans as well. And so Booker T. Washington actually read about this. He quickly leaped into action. And keep in mind there, Professor Washington was the most powerful Black person in the United States at this time. So what he did was he says, oh my God, this is discriminatory. So he reached out to his Tuskegee machine, which were his power brokers, Black and white, behind the scene. Within 1 week, he was able to have this legislation killed in Congress. Now, what does that mean? If Washington had not stepped into would have not would have not actually acted, so to speak, that means that blacks from the West Indies, blacks from South America, or blacks from anywhere after 1915, those folks were not have been allowed to come to the United States. And as a matter of fact, if you remember, Marcus Garvey came to the U.S. March of 1916. That would have included him. So in essence, no UNIA would have been headquartered in the United States. It wouldn't have happened because again, he was able to come to the U.S. and benefited from what Washington was able to do by defeating the African exclusionary measures. So he was a giant during his time. He was a controversial figure, but again, you have to keep in mind that Washington is operating in a society, in a predominantly white society, and trying to really protect its black population here. But he also extended those privileges to blacks who wanted to immigrate here.
Real quick, and we're sidetracking a little bit, but to Tuskegee University. Now, Booker T. Washington partnered with George Washington Carver to build that university, correct? And then, how did he raise the money to build it?
Well, he basically remember George Washington Carver was in Iowa. He was a tenured professor in Iowa, of course, a scientist. And Booker T. Washington reached out to him. He says, "Hey, Dr. Carver, we need your help here, because the poor communities of blacks need, I guess, someone to kind of build a science department." And that's exactly what George Washington Carver did. Now, keep in mind, a lot of the money from Tuskegee really came from a lot of wealthy white philanthropists. And it is true, man, that again, Booker T. Washington, how do I say this, man? He was able to kind of work between worlds, a predominantly white setting, but also prominent African Americans. And so, again, and keep in mind, Tuskegee was built. The university was actually built by the students. I mean, they physically built this institution. And today, Dinus, Tuskegee University is the 10th largest institution in terms of land size in the United States.
Wow. Okay, I guess let's get back to the go ahead.
And let me just say this to you too, man. Keep in mind that Tuskegee University was a Pan-African university. Most people don't realize that blacks from throughout the diaspora were in attendance. Many students came from Latin America, from Brazil, from Panama, from Puerto Rico. Believe it or not, there were some students there from the Philippines and Japan, and literally hundreds of thousands from Africa. And so this institution served as a haven to attract Africans or blacks from throughout the diaspora.
Wow. So let's get back into the Exclusionary Act. Did we cover everything there, or is anything else that we need?
Well,
because I mean, there's people in the chat room are saying that they didn't know anything about this, and
Oh sure. Look, and honestly, here's the thing, Dinus. People and immigrants, unfortunately, and I'm going to get just sidetracked for just a second here.
No, go ahead. That's fine. And you're going in and out just a little bit. It's starting to distort again because I really want people to hear this. Go ahead.
Listen. I constantly tell people that African Americans are a unique population within the context of the United States. There is no other group in the United States like Black Americans. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, clearly the indigenous population was here, right? And the white population came as immigrants. In essence, every other group to this country came as an immigrant, with the exception of Black folks, of domestic African Americans. We've been here for 500 years. We are anchored in all aspects of American history. It is impossible to talk about the United States without talking about the African American contribution or the African American narrative. Absolutely impossible. We're not like, we're not, if you will, the same as people coming from the Caribbean. We're not the same as Africans who voluntarily come over here for a better life. We're all Black, but our narrative is different. And again, our contributions to this country are completely different from latter immigrants who come here. They're benefiting from our legacy. It's what I'm saying. And people tend to
Right.
think, well, all black people are the same. Well, we're all black, but our narratives are not the same. I mean, that's just the reality of it. If you critically read the Constitution of the United States, it's talking about African Americans. It mentions African Americans more than anyone else. And just to add to this, man, I'm speaking specifically in one way about the United States, but the truth of the matter is, I can actually say that with Canada, because up until the 1960s, man, almost all the blacks in Canada came from the United States.
Mm.
Now, if you if you've been following the news over the last week or so, I don't know if you're familiar with the person by the name of Viola Desmond. She's
I'm
appearing
not.
on the well, she is she's sometimes viewed as being the Rosa Parks of Canada because of what she did in the 1940s. And and now she appears on the $10 bill. She's the first black person who appears on Canadian currency. Her
Okay.
ancestors comes from the United States. She is a descendant of a black loyalist. And the black loyalists actually came from the States, man, some 300 years ago, and they migrated north into the Canadian maritime provinces. And so
Mm.
I say all that to say this, man, is that the US and Canada are parallel in so many ways. Again, because the early black Canadians were all African Americans. Almost all of them were African Americans. These are African Americans who actually settled from the maritime provinces to Quebec, Ontario, through the central provinces of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, all the way out to the west coast of British Columbia. And the contributions that they made to the development of Canada are massive. They're just absolutely massive, man. And again, just like African Americans, African Canadians are anchored in all aspects of Canadian history. They fought in every war, just like African Americans have fought in every US war. And so oftentimes, unfortunately, immigrants, black, white, what have you, Hispanic, they tend not to know this aspect of US history. And they tend to kind of have this attitude as if that, well, black Americans haven't contributed. Well, you have benefited, you are benefiting from our legacy. There again, no other, the new Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, which is 14th and Constitution Avenue. It's right across the street from the Washington Monument. No other museum could have gone there. You couldn't have put an Arab American museum there, or a Chinese American museum there, or any other museum. It had to be the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, because for over 5 centuries, again, we have been a part of this country. We provided the primary wealth of this country. And again, we're anchored in all aspects of the history of the United States.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Why do you think, because you mentioned how we can't have a conversation about I guess the foundation of America without discussing the black contribution to it. But they try, and they've been having that conversation in history books as far as the foundation of America, and omitting a lot of what black Americans contributed to it. How are Africans, because when we talk about the slave trade is really taught on a surface level in Africa. How are Africans able to continue and discuss uh, being able or having the opportunity to come to America? Not just Africans, immigrants in general, but since we're talking about Africans, how are they able to continue to have the discussion about how they're able to come to America, or immigrating to America, but not including I guess, the foundation of that, or the role that Black Americans played in making it so?
Well, let me just say this, and again, I mentioned earlier the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture, man, which was absolutely just Dr. Lonnie Bunch was the founding president, and I cannot thank him enough for ensuring this institution actually is now a part of our national history. And one of the things that he's doing is he's working with high schools, elementary schools, state colleges, Ivy League universities, and HBCUs, man, to ensure, and government officials to ensure that this information it gets out. Far too many immigrants who come here have a lack of understanding regarding what America is. and they see America as you know, as this society that was established only by whites. Whites, yes, they're still the majority, but they tend to kind of negate that. And let me just say this to you too. I can't allow African nations to get off the hook because they don't do enough, man, in terms of the black engaging Black Americans. You and I have spoken offline quite a few times, and I've given you many, many examples of how African Americans have utilized their institutions, their homegrown institutions, to engage the entire African continent.
Mm-hmm.
And unfortunately, African nations are just not doing enough, man, to really discover the huge contributions that Blacks have made. But to answer your question specifically, man, I think there needs to be more partnership with our national institutions in terms of museums, in terms of universities, interacting with African nations in terms of ensuring that the Africans who want to become Americans understand what this country is and understand what that again, the immigrants, if you're from Latin America, if you're from Europe, whatever, you're benefiting. If you're coming to the United States, you have benefited somehow from the legacy of a pre-existing Black population, specifically African Americans who've been here for 500 plus years.
Oh, wow. Wow. Let's see if we have any more. Okay, so now can we speak on, I guess, the role Booker T. Washington had in regards to the founding of the ANC? Did I say that correct? Or
well,
relationship
here's
with
what
the
he
ANC?
did. Let me just say this, man. Tuskegee Institute, later Tuskegee University, man, again, was a hub for, if you will, Pan-African train of thoughts, and for Africans and for Blacks from all over the world to come. As I mentioned to you before, man, Marcus Garvey began reaching out to Booker T. Washington in 1912 after reading Booker T. Washington's biography, Up from Slavery. And they were corresponding for 3 years until Washington passes away in 1915. And if you read the Booker T. Washington papers, which are 15 volumes, and each volume is roughly 300 to 500 pages, you'll see all of the correspondences between Washington and Garvey. And Garvey sends Washington some kind of a template of what he wants to do with the UNIA. And that template is a replica, an exact replica of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model.
Mm-hmm.
And so what I'm saying to you is not, the UNIA is not an anomaly. It's just not, because he's basing it off of something that exists before. Now, John Dube, for example, he's from South Africa. John Dube is the first president of the African National Congress, man. And you know, and I do want to say this, man. I believe the African National Congress was actually established, I think, in 1906, I believe. I believe it was 1906. 1912. Just, I think, 3 years after the NAACP. When you look at its original constitution, the ANC Constitution, it's based on the NAACP Constitution. When John Dube comes to the United States, one of the ways that he's able to come here is through the use of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And keep in mind, the AME Church, which is a Black American institution, first lands in South Africa in the 1890s. And this particular institution is actually used, man, to engage the Africans who are there, man, in terms of, in terms of helping them to fight for their liberation. Now, John Dube visits Tuskegee University, right? And he's so amazed by what he sees, what Booker T. Washington has developed. He goes back to South Africa, and John Dube, again, who is the first president of the ANC, he establishes the Allonge Institute. And the Allonge Institute is a prestigious school, even today in South Africa. And as a matter of fact, it was the first institution built by a Black South African on the African continent. And again, the Allonge Institute is an exact replica of the Booker T. Washington Tuskegee model, because John Dube had toured Tuskegee, and he saw what he actually saw something that he liked, and he says, well, let me duplicate this in South Africa.
Mm-hmm. All right, we got a question in the chat room. It's a little bit off topic, but since we're dealing with the relationship between Black America and Africa, or Black Americans in Africa, Should we be involved in South Africa with sanctions now coming? And if so, what can we do?
Well, let me just say this, man. I honestly think that, that particular issue should be dealt with South Africans on the ground. I will say this is that the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, and other Black political organizations for a long time were engaged in the liberation struggle for South Africans, and so we played a huge role in that regard. But at this point now, I think whatever happens in South Africa, and South Africans need to take the lead. And if they need us to assist, well, I think that we can actually sit down and and establish something at the level of our institutions. But again, South Africans need to take the lead.
Hmm. So you're thinking that African Americans should not get involved at all, or?
Well, again, I just think the South Africans should actually call the shots now, and because again, it's their country.
Mm-hmm.
It is their country, and so.
No, you're correct. Because I mean, I'm noticing that it's weird, with this land reform going on in South Africa, all of a sudden Australia and a lot of, especially Western media, they're giving their opinion on it as far as getting involved.
Well, that can happen. And again, we have institutions who can actually kind of express our views in terms of that, man. But again, I would surmise that, well, the leadership of South Africa will, if they need some type of outside influence to kind of partner with them, well, I'm sure those folks can sit down at the table and map out what that should look like.
Mm. Well, let's see what else we got in the chat room. Now, Booker T. Washington, what, so, we discussed him in his involvement in the ANC. Did we cover that?
We briefly talked about them, and also he was extremely important to Liberia. I think we mentioned the Liberian crisis.
Let's talk about Liberia. Let's talk about that.
Right. Keep in mind, in 1884, 1885, all of Africa was colonized. The entire continent was under European occupation, with the exception of Ethiopia and Liberia. So the Germans, the French, and the British have reached out to the United States and said to the U.S. government, what is your take on Liberia? Is that your colony? And as a matter of fact, man, the colonial powers had, Liberia in the past was larger than what it is today. As a matter of fact, the British and the French, I believe, absorbed small portions of it, of what is now Sierra Leone, and also the Ivory Coast. Mm-hmm. But anyway, the U.S. government did not respond to the colonial powers right away. Mm-hmm. And the U.S. ambassador to Liberia reached out to President Washington, Booker T. Washington. And he said to Washington, he says, listen, Liberia's in trouble. And this was in 1905. And so what Booker T. Washington did was call a delegation of Liberian politicians to the United States. And from 1905 until 1912, he was the chief negotiator between Liberia and the States. And what happened over time was he was able to get a huge loan from the United States, which really ensured that Liberia would maintain its sovereignty over time. Now, there were some stipulations with that, but Liberia was not colonized. And so Booker T. Washington really saved the independence of Liberia. If he had not stepped in, it is highly likely that Liberia would have been absorbed into one of the French colonies or the British colonies or what have you. But Washington had enough political power and influence, man, to call that delegation to Washington, and he served as the chief negotiator.
So after Booker T. Washington, what incumbents did Booker T. Washington have? Like who I guess didn't, and of course you had the WEDB Du Bois rivalry with Marcus Garvey. Who I guess didn't agree with Booker T. Washington? Or
let me just say this in terms of Du Bois was an intellectual. Well, I don't want to say he was. Well, I'll just say it. He was. Oh, Du Bois was a complicated figure, but what I'll say is that he took issue with the fact that Washington was kind of a he was an accommodationist, and when it came to the political rights of blacks and whatnot, Washington believed in economic parity. He felt that somehow that look, white Americans they can have the political governing body of the United States. Blacks should develop more or less their own economic independence. That was Du Bois's argument with Washington because he felt like this. He felt like Washington was just kind of overlooking the political contributions, if you will, of blacks. But keep in mind, man, a lot of people were not fearful, but jealous of Booker T. Washington because he was, again, the most powerful black American in the United States. This guy, I mean, his influence was huge on blacks and whites. I mean, he was the, if you will.
Brother, you're going, you're distortion again.
Sorry about that. I mean, Washington was, if you will, I'm sure you've heard this old term, the head nigger in charge. He was kind of like the person. He was it. I mean, he yielded tremendous power throughout the United States. Tremendous. And so I think Du Bois, in some ways, man, I mean, he was jealous of that aspect of it. Mm-hmm. And again, Garvey, man, I mean, Garvey reached out to Booker T. Washington, as I stated before, in 1912, because he understood exactly the impact that this man had, man, and on terms of, I guess, economic empowerment for black folks.
And what happened when he reached out to Booker T. Washington?
Who's that? Garvey?
Right.
Well, what he did, man, eventually what he did do, he reached out to Booker T. Washington, and Garvey and Washington wanted to meet with him, but of course Washington passes away in 1915, mm-hmm. and Garvey doesn't get to the United States until 1916. And keep in mind, the African exclusionary measures had been defeated by Washington, which allowed Garvey to come to the United States. And so when Garvey did come to the United States, man, he met with the black elite, A. Philip Randolph and others. And Randolph, which is another topic altogether, really kind of gave Garvey the platform to kind of interact with the African American elite here. And of course, I don't want to get off topic, but Garvey toured 38 states in the United States. And what he said was, my God, of all the places that I've been in the world, this is the most sophisticated and well-organized group of black people I've ever met. He's talking about blacks in the United States because he traveled extensively throughout Europe, the Caribbean, and Latin America. And unfortunately, the blacks there had not been as organized. As a matter of fact, John Hendrick Clark stated, he says that African Americans have established more independent black institutions than any other black population on the globe, not because we were smarter or because we had more money necessarily, it's because we had to. It was a type of racism that existed in the United States that we had to kind of create something out of nothing because white America was not going to give us anything. So therefore, you had to kind of make it on your own.
We have a question in the chat room. What do you think the impact would have been if Marcus Garvey and Booker T. Washington were able to link up together? What impact?
I think that Garvey, first of all, was an amazing person, charismatic, brilliant. He had this captivating personality which could speak to the common person. And I honestly think that in some ways, man, that, if you will, the black world, so to speak, man, would be a different place today, without question. But unfortunately, that did not happen because there were some missteps that he made along the way. But he was able to kind of give people the at least the illusion of. I'm going to use Dr. John Hendrick Clark words. Garvey was able to give African Americans, if you will, or in this illusion of nationhood. And what I mean by that, man, that he was believable, and he was much more supportive by blue collar blacks than he was with the black elites, because the black elites were already wealthy, and and some of those had some issue with Garvey for any number of reasons, which I don't want to get into right now. But to answer your question specifically, I think it would have been definitely, we would have been better off collectively as a people. But here's the mistake that I think that perhaps Garvey did make, man. Again, the UNIA was headquarters where? In the United States.
Right.
And when he was deported, man, basically it dissolved. And it would have been nice if there was some area outside of America that he could have been able to maintain what he had built, and that was not the case. And I think that speaks to the organizational structure of blacks in the United States. You actually have a huge part of the population, man, that is, that has more money, I guess, education, and in one collective area, and that was just not the case in Europe, in Latin America, or even in Africa during that time.
Let's see here. Okay, I was reading something online just now, and I guess W.E.B. Du Bois did not like Booker T. Washington. In fact, what I'm reading right now says that he hold on, where was I just had it right here. Goodness, I just had it in front of me. Hold on, where is it?
Well, let me just say this. What I would recommend, if you critically review, and you could go online and probably find this, take a critical look at at what Dr. Tyreen Wright is saying, and she takes a slightly different perspective. And keep in mind, she's an expert when it comes to Booker T. Washington in Africa specifically, and so she is not necessarily saying that that they are at odds. But again, what I would do is critically look at how she explains the subtle nuances between their differences.
Because what I'm reading right here, it says that let me go back to it. Just had it in front of me. Come on, Dinus, where are you at? I just had it in front of me. Okay. Let's see here. Here we go. Late in his career, Washington was criticized by civil rights leader and NAACP founder W.E.B. Du Bois. Du Bois and his supporters opposed the Atlanta Address as the Atlanta Compromise because it provided that African Americans should work for and submit to white political rule. Du Bois insisted on full civil rights, due process of law, increased political representation for African Americans, which he believed can only be achieved through activism and higher education for African Americans. Du Bois labeled Washington the Great Accommodator. Washington's response was the Great Accommodator.
Right. And let me just say this to you too, man. Let me just say this to you too, man. Now, question to you. And I promise, Dinus, I'm not picking on you at all, man. From your perspective, what is the legacy of W.E.B. Du Bois? What is the lasting legacy?
My thing is, no one really has anything positive to say about him, because you bring up W.E.B. Du Bois when it comes to Marcus Garvey. Right. He tried to block Marcus Garvey. Right here, he doesn't agree with Booker T. Washington, but I kind of agree with. I'm gonna have to side with W.E.B. Du Bois in regards to this.
No, and again, I'm going to relate back to John Hendrick Clark, man. Washington understood that where he was, he understood the times of America, and he understood white supremacy, and he understood that he had to kind of protect, if you will, African Americans in a society where they have not even today reckoned with their black population. But let me just answer this, man. I didn't ask you the specific legacies of Booker T. Washington, but they're massive. I mean, as I stated to you before, Tuskegee is the 10th largest university in America in terms of land size. Booker T. Washington also was instrumental in the foundation of West Virginia State University, another HBCU. And if you go around the world, man, as I said, in South Africa, the Allonge Institute was actually structured after Tuskegee. And you and I had talked about the Achimota School in Ghana.
Right.
That school is also, man, structured after the Tuskegee Institute. And I could go on and on and on across Africa. And so these are some of the lasting legacies, man, of what Booker T. Washington was able to do in his life. I mean, they're massive. Now, for me with Du Bois, I mean, in terms of his intellectual prowess, literature, I mean, he's actually unmatched during his time. The guy was absolutely brilliant, man, but he was a prisoner to his class. And what do I mean by that? He was an African American elite,
Right.
and unfortunately, he could not move beyond those circles. Garvey could, Booker T. Washington could. Garvey could talk to the average person in the street and inspire you. Unfortunately, Washington could. I mean, unfortunately, Du Bois could not.
Let's see what we got in the chat room. So did Booker T. Washington actually made it to Africa, right? Unlike Garvey.
No, Booker T. Washington did not make it to Africa. He did not.
Okay. And we're changing subjects a little bit. What are your thoughts on Marcus Garvey not actually reaching or making it to the continent physically?
You know what? That was actually surprising to me. I found out that a few years ago that he didn't make it.
I did too.
And honestly, and I've seen some of the scholars on Garvey, and a lot of them, how do I say this? Although he was a Pan-Africanist, he was pro-Black and all, Garvey was a Westerner. What I mean by that, he was an African born in the New World. And I think that in some ways impact his thinking about Africa, if you will. I do believe if perhaps he would have lived as long as Du Bois, and Du Bois dies at the age of 95, perhaps he would have made it to Africa. Now, I will say this: if the UNIA could have survived after Garvey was deported, that I do think, man, that eventually he would have gone all over Africa. But unfortunately, as you well know, the UNA lost its luster after he was deported.
No, I'm reading about Booker T. Washington, and I'm seeing that he had a wide range of supporters. I mean, Andrew Carnegie, William Howard Taft, John D. Rockefeller.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, this guy was called to the White House. I mean, he was Dinus, I cannot tell you how much power this guy had. I put it to you this way. Now, here's something that was not quite positive about Booker T. Washington. Let's just say you had an issue with him, right? And you were a prominent figure, Black or white man.
Right.
Washington could actually pull this. Let's just say you were a major a Black leader, and and had a church or whatever, you had a business or something, and you had written something negative about Booker T. Washington in the paper. He basically could pull his strings, man. After he read what you said in the paper, you could lose what you've had. This is the type of power that this guy had. I mean, he was a powerful person. He had a lot of power. He could make or break Black folks, and some white people, and some whites. The guy was just pretty amazing in that way. And as I said to you before, he was instrumental in the formation of West Virginia State University. He appointed the first Black president of West Virginia State University. He handpicked him.
How did he get all this support, especially in a time like this? I mean, we're dealing with segregation. We're coming out of slavery, post-Civil War. I mean, we're going through the Reconstruction era. He's in the South. Like, how did he get all the support from non-Black people?
I'm glad you asked the question. What I'm going to do is to recommend. There's a because I'm going to recommend. There's a lecture that Dr. John Hendrick Clark does. It's about a 2-hour lecture, and it's about the lifetimes of Booker T. Washington, and he actually lays all of that out. Okay. Secondly, again, I would critically look at the writings of Dr. Tyreen Wright. Right. She is a professor at the CUNY University of New York. She's an expert in Booker T. Washington. And so I think both those two folks would be are in a better position to kind of really extensively answer your question more than I could.
Okay, absolutely. I'll definitely reach out to her. Somebody in the chat room, Ayodele Sosu, she said that I've been telling this to them on the continent about the African exclusion measure, especially those who their guardians lives in the U.S. and remits money to them. What are your thoughts on that statement?
She's been telling people.
She's been telling her African friends on the continent about the exclusion measure, especially those who their guardians live in the U.S. and sends money back to the continent, back to them in Africa.
Right. And so, and again, man, I just think it's important for immigrants to understand this, man. Again, far too many people, even African Americans, don't understand their own rich history. They just don't get it, and I've let me share something that's not too pleasant, but I will with you. I was on the plane to Ghana a few years ago, and I was sitting next to a gentleman. He was a Senegalese American. He was living in North Carolina. And we were talking. I was telling him this is my first time to Ghana. And we got on the topic of African Americans. And he was asking the questions, well, what's wrong with you people? And, this type of thing. And, and I had to kind of politely give him, a history, give him an explanation of basic U.S. history. And this African immigrant was under the impression that Black Americans had made no contributions to the country at all. And I was thinking in the back of my mind, I mean, what do they teach immigrants who come to this country? I mean, what are you teaching these people? I mean, again, I had to explain to him that America's domestic Black population have been here for over 500 years. They are, I told him that it is impossible to extract America from their experience. They are part of all of America. America exists because of them. And he was like, and I asked him, I said, why don't you know this? And I asked the guy, why don't you know this basic U.S. history? I mean, you're an immigrant. And I said to him, look, if I'm going to settle in France or some other country, I'm going to take the time to learn something about the history. He was quite patronizing, quite negative. And and unfortunately, I've gotten this from a lot of African immigrants who come here, and I think to myself, this is extremely, it's sad that you don't know this aspect of U.S. history because it's core. It's core to the American experience. I mean, what was the Civil War fought over? Slavery.
Slavery.
Who were the slaves in this country? Black Americans. I mean, how could you not know this part of history? It's just, and it was just so shocking to me, as if he was speaking to me as if I was the other. And I had to remind him, look, you as a Black person in the United States have benefited. You have benefited from the African American narrative. This is why you can now come here. I mean, think about civil rights. Civil rights was not spearheaded by African immigrants. Civil rights was spearheaded by the Black Americans who have been here for hundreds of years, who fought and died for not only the rights of themselves, but of women, Hispanics, Asian Americans, and others.
Somebody was asking in the chat, why haven't, I mean, of course you have independent nations, Black independent nations, whether in the Caribbean, of course, in Africa. Why hasn't Black America been able to create, even though we have Liberia, why hasn't Black America been able to create an independent nation within America?
Why should we? We are American. I mean, honestly, we are American. This is our country. Whether whites or immigrants or anyone else want to agree with that or not, this is our home. It's really that simple. Dinus, it's interesting to me that I sometimes when I'm online and I'm speaking with Africans from other parts of the world, they're expecting me as a Black American to be angry with the history of marginalization by the white majority, and somehow they want me to kind of denounce the United States and all of that. And you know, and I can concur that America has done some awful things to their domestic black population, and they still haven't reckoned with who and what we are here. And you know, and that's something that we're just going to have to kind of continue to work through. But at the same time, too, man, I don't know any other country on the globe where tens of millions of people are dying to get here. They're dying to get here. I mean, I'm serious. Do you know right now, Dinas, there are, legally speaking, 45 million immigrants in this country, legally. Legally. I'm not talking about the illegal aliens, the folks who have crossed the border or who have overstayed their visa. You know, they're coming to my country. They're coming to a country that was built on the backs of African Americans, right? And they're benefiting from it. So this is my country. You know, and you know, it's just that simple. I am proud to be a Black American. I don't want to be anything else. Again, we are responsible for building the most dynamic country on the face of the globe. Even oh God, the gentleman's name, Paul Robeson, said this in an interview. He was being interviewed in Australia in 1963, and I quote: he said, "African Americans provided the primary wealth of the United States," and that's true. So every African American should be proud of the contributions that they have made to this wonderful country of ours. It's not perfect. It's far from it. But I don't know any other place on the globe where tens of millions of people are trying to get to. I mean, it's and I mean, that's just not the case for Africa right now. Maybe in 50, 60 years it may be. But for now, people are trying to get here. And this is something that we built. And so, again, every Black American should be proud of their contributions. And, you know, and not, you know, to, you know, take a seat for anyone. I mean, these people who come here and successful, look, you may call this a stretch, man, but I'll say this, man, they have benefited from the legacy, the blood, sweat, and tears of African Americans who have fought and died, man, for centuries.
I agree.
And that's just the reality of it. And so I don't take a back seat to any immigrant who comes here, who tries to be patronizing and somehow make me look bad. And because I quickly tell them, you're coming to my country. And if you are superior, then why don't you develop your own country instead of coming here?
So as far as, let's get back to the African Exclusionary Act. So what was going on in Panama, correct?
Right. And again, what was happening is that the Panama Canal was being constructed.
Okay.
And once it was complete, man, again, there were those in the U.S. government who felt that these immigrants wanted to migrate here because at that time frame, much of the Caribbean and South America was impoverished.
Your sound is starting to act up again.
Let me go back. Also, in 1914, it was, as I stated before, the Panama Canal was complete.
Professor Davis, your sound is starting to act up again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better. Go ahead.
No, as I was saying before, man, in 1914, the Panama Canal was complete.
Right.
And as I stated before, there were some in the U.S. government who felt that these immigrants from the Caribbean, from South America, were trying to immigrate here because those regions were poor at that time. And so they felt that these folks wanted to be here for economic opportunity. And white politicians says, "Oh no, we don't want any of these. we don't want any more blacks here at all."
So my question is now: the Panama Canal connects the Atlantic Ocean with the Pacific Ocean.
That is correct.
What would that have to do with Panamanians wanting to come to America?
Well, and again, many of them did want to come here because again, as you know, the Panama Canal was an American project, right?
Right. Okay. Got you. Okay. Right.
That was an American project, and these folks said, well, we've built and And again, maybe we can come here for economic opportunity because America is the land of opportunity, and I get that. But and as you well know, listen, Dinus, if you look at the immigration patterns in the United States, and just to share this with you, America has never ever wanted Black folks here. I'll
Right.
give you a perfect example. U.S. Congress outlawed the importation of Africans in 1808, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so all the way from 1808, really until the 19, my God, man, until the 1980s, very, very few Africans or folks from the Caribbean were able to come here. That's why that the 50 plus million Blacks in the United States, some 90% of the Blacks that are here are domestic African Americans, folks like you and I, whose ancestors have been here for hundreds of years. And the other roughly 8 to 10% are Caribbean and African immigrants. And that's because America did not want Black folks, and pretty much really still don't want Blacks in this country, because from up until 1970, something like 80% of all the immigrants came from Europe. After 1970, it shifted to Asia and Latin America. And so after 1970 until today, the overwhelming majority of immigrants who come to the United States now are either from Asia or Latin America. And the immigrants from the Caribbean and Africa are maybe 5% of the population, maybe. And that's really not going to change. I saw a projection into 2060, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they project in 2060 the Black population will be roughly 80 to 85 million people. And of that 80 to 85 million people, still, man, what? Oh God, roughly 85% of the population will be domestic African American, and the other 15% will be immigrants who are Caribbean or from Africa.
See what we got in the chat room. Mola says you're always dropping knowledge. That's why I always bring them on.
Well, and again, and I just think look, Black Americans really need to understand their history. That's just imperative, man, that we understand the contributions that we've made to this country, and that we are not. And I want to be clear when I say this. I am thrilled to death that America is allowing an increasing number of immigrants from the Caribbean and from Africa into the United States. But oftentimes what we try to do is to say that we're all the same. And what I mean by that, yes, we're all Black, but there are different stories, there are different narratives. And and I constantly tell people that African Americans have the most distinct narrative in the United States. We are unlike any other group.
Mm-hmm.
We're not like the Caribbean immigrants. We're not like the African immigrants. Why? Well, because we're not immigrants. we are not immigrants at all to this country. But our contributions, man, are massive in every way. We are Americans. Whether we want to agree with it or not, we are Americans. That's what we are. We built the country. Listen, if you look at the works of Dr. Edward Baptist, who's a white American at Cornell University, he wrote a book in 2014 called The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism. The book is about 400 pages. 50 of those pages are references. And he's clearly showing you from day one how the Black American narrative is anchored is weaved throughout the entire history of America. All of it. And I think, again, that, just to say that, well, we're all the same, we're not all the same. We're just not. Mm-hmm. The Black American narrative is different. We're different. We are not all the same. We're all Black, yes. But we have, it would be just like me going to Jamaica and all of a sudden trying to kind of claim that I'm just like a Jamaican who's been there for 300-400 years. Well, I'm an immigrant to Jamaica. And yes, I may be contributing to the Jamaican story, but I'm coming as an immigrant.
See what else we have in the chat room. Someone made a statement here. Let me try to find it. Someone made the comment how can Africans not be allowed to come back to a place that they were here first already? I'm totally confused. I don't know.
Well, let, let me
Do
just,
you understand what you're
you
saying?
know, I'm assuming that this person is saying that there were Africans who were already here. Now, I will say this. What we know is this, man, is that um, the British came in 1607 and established Jamestown, right?
Hmm.
And but 110 years. Well, let me just say this. According to Dr. Henry Louis Gates, uh, that the first recorded African in in what is now the United States, Florida, was João Garado, who came in 1513, and he came as a free African, and
Hmm.
João Garado was from what is now Angola, and
Okay.
he came with Ponce de Leon, to find gold and all of that, and set up shop in Florida. And later on, the Spaniards brought some slaves, and there were communities, if you will, African Americans or pre-African Americans in Florida before the British got here. I'm assuming that this person is perhaps talking about the literature of Dr. Van Sertima, who wrote the book "They Came Before Columbus,"
Right. It's like
and there,
on Abu Bukhari coming from Mali, and yeah.
right, and there's that possibility. Now, what I would love to see, Dinus, is in the literature of the folks in the literature in the institutions in Mali or West Africa. I would love to see the written literature indicating that there were Africans who sailed to the Americas. And I think that would actually answer or settle all the questions about this, and there would be no speculation. Let me just say this. One of the things that I like about African American culture, man, we have documented our history throughout the centuries. And I had mentioned this to you before. One of the largest Black American institutions in the world is the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
Right.
And they have 20 Episcopal districts throughout the globe. And if you ever go through one of the local Episcopal districts, they have archives of our history going back a couple of centuries.
Oh wow.
And so you can see what we've done. One of the oldest, I mean, the oldest African American newspaper in the world, I mean, it is the Christian Recorder. And that was established in the 1840s, I believe, and is still in existence. And it was designed or developed by the AME Church. And even when you go to Canada, man, the Black Nova Scotians, who are us, they've been there for 300 years, man. They've recorded all their history. And what I mean by that, man, there are 46 to 47 Black communities throughout Nova Scotia, man, who preserve that history. And so it's already written down. And so you don't have to speculate what we've done because it's already recorded history. And and this person mentions about the Mali, whatnot. Again, what would be instrumental for us, man, if we could see the literature that those possibly that those Africans who did come to America, that they've recorded this, and made a record of it. So I just think that's important.
Okay. All right. Let's see here. See what else we got here in the chat room. I think there was one more question that I wanted to ask that um okay, so in fact this is the last question, last statement. Somebody in the chat room brought up that there's really no future here in America for Black people because we've been here all this time, but we really haven't gained that much progress and we don't own anything. And I know we talked about this in the past as far as like in Boston, the net worth of Black people is like at $8 or something like that. What would be your response to statements like this? Like, there's no
Well,
for Black Americans here in America. Start looking to Africa. Uh,
well, my question to that person is listen, there are 54 independent African countries. What have those African countries done not only to engage and to reach out to Black Americans? What have they done with the Black diaspora to ensure that, let's just say, maybe 50,000 African Americans wanted to migrate to some place in Africa? Are those countries prepared to absorb that population of people? So are African Americans are just going to just up and leave, and without any clear plan of where to go? I mean, what, where? Is there any indication that that the 54 independent countries, man, are engaging us in in such a way that it could improve our quality of life? And my answer, as far as I know right now, is no. So what I do know is that we've built this country, and that every Black American is not suffering at all. There's a lot of us, man, who have done quite well in these United States and have no intentions on going anywhere else at all.
Mm-hmm. And then a lot of people will say, okay, we built this country, but we were slaves. So building the country as a slave doesn't give you ownership. What would be your response to that?
Well, you know what, and this is this is a true part of U.S. history. Many of us were slaves. We suffered through terror, slavery, Jim Crow, so on and so forth. And that's just the reality of it. Now, how did we get here? Well, let me just go, and I'm going to go here too.
Go ahead.
How in the world did 450,000 Africans get to the United States? Well, transatlantic slave trade, the British and their African partners were complicit in slavery. And as a result of that, man, we're here. Yes, Africans sold Africans into slavery, and it was business. So, and so, and that's just a fact. And so once we got here, we had to kind of create something brand new. And that's exactly what we did, man. We had to kind of create something. We had to make the best of a very difficult situation. Fast forward hundreds of years later, the United States is a superpower. Not the case in much of Africa. As a matter of fact, many of the Africans are trying to get here to the West. I mean, it's a complicated situation, man. It really is. But unfortunately, a lot of African nations have not come to terms with the fact that, look, your children are here because you were slave trading with Europeans. That's just the reality of it.
Mm. All right, I'm gonna read one more comment. Josiah said, "I'm gonna stop following you. I will stop following you if you keep bringing this professor. He is poisonous. He has no solution but to praise himself." What would be your response to a comment like that?
Well, I would say continue. If he wants to stop following, he has a right to do whatever he wants to do.
True. Yeah, he does.
And so, but I am not going to sit here and baby people and
Right.
not tell the truth. Africans were complicit in the slave trade. They were slave trading for centuries. They played the game. I mean, it's the reality of it. I mean, it's just the truth. I mean, no other continent, Dinus, experienced 1,500 years of the Arab slave trade, almost 500 years of the transatlantic slave trade. How do we know this? There are tens of millions of Black people in the Americas. How did they get here? They didn't get on ships and just sail here. We have the records. According to the Transatlantic Slave Database, there were over 35,000 voyages back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. It's insanity. It happened. It's an ugly part of world history, but it happened. And I am sorry that your guest is bothered by that fact, but it happened.
You don't have to apologize. You don't have to apologize.
And it happened. African Americans in this country had to make a way out of no way. Where did they make it? Tell me exactly. I wish, and I would ask your guest, man, when did an African country come and get us? When? Who came and got us? Nobody.
But the argument that's being made is that when the slave trade happened, these African countries weren't in existence until after colonialism. So
But
therefore,
still, what I'm saying, but still, they were complicit. They were complicit, man. And I'm not suggesting in any way that that there weren't folks on the ground who tried to kind of stop it, man. But listen, here's the thing, man. And and I'll throw this at you too. And this is true. The concept of a collective African identity it comes from Black Americans, it comes from Blacks in the West Indians, and so on and so forth. This idea of being African, man, is new. Africans did not develop it at all. They just didn't. And so I get that. I definitely understand it. And you're 100% right. These countries were not formed at this time. But Dinus, the fact that it lasted for almost 500 years is just, I mean, it's unfathomable. I mean, it's just hard to kind of comprehend something that horrific and tragic lasted for such a long time. But it did, and it happened. And I don't think that a lot of Africans come to terms with that, man. Listen, the transatlantic slave trade resonates more with blacks in the diaspora than it does on the African continent. It's almost as if it's not their story, and it is their story. They were complicit in this. And, and people tend not to want to hear this, but it's the truth. I mean, it's an ugly part of human history, but it's the truth.
All right, then. Well, on that note, we'll go ahead and close out. Brother, please give everybody your contact information.
Sure. Yes, Professor.
And go ahead and close out.
Well, listen, thank you so much for inviting me back on the show.
Always, no matter what, you always have a home here on this platform. People need to hear this information. I know a lot of people defend it, but I mean, it's important. So.
Sure. And honestly, man, I think that we're at a point now where we need to mature and understand that, look, these things happen, and keep in mind that history and culture are extremely important. And if people are going to immigrate here, look, you have to understand context. And again, Dinus, if there were a ton of examples of how these African countries were engaging the Black diaspora in a constructive way, where we could see how they're improving the quality of life for Blacks in the West. Wow, I love to hear it. Mm-hmm. I have many African friends, and I ask the question all the time, and I don't get any answers at all. I've told you many examples of what we've done here, and we are the formerly enslaved Africans in the West. We are the formerly enslaved Africans in the United States. So my contact information is Professor Davis. You can reach me at Davis, L as in Larry, N as in Nancy, 20750 @yahoo.com. Dinus, thank you so much for having me on the show.
I appreciate you coming on. It's always a pleasure.
And I must say, man, Booker T. Washington was an exceptional person in terms of what he's been able to do. He really influenced Garvey. He really, his impact and his legacy, man, is still with us today in concrete and measurable ways.
Let me ask you, people are asking, are you open to a debate? People want to debate you. Are you open to a debate?
You know what? Look, I don't know.
Okay,
Just
well,
a simple no.
LJ said, there you go. He said no. So there you go. But LJ, you were supposed to debate Emeka, and I emailed you and I messaged you, and you never responded. So I know the debate with Emeka is still open. He would love to debate you. So you need to get in contact with me.
Listen, one question,
go ahead.
Linus, before I go, and I like to ask online. The information that I'm providing to your guest, man, is all documented information.
It is,
and so
exactly.
And so it's not as if I'm making up stuff to upset folks at all. And I honestly don't know why people would have an issue with just the truth, because this is just information that, again, I think that we're at a point in our country, man, that we just need to tell the truth. And that's what I'm trying to do, just to tell the truth in terms of Black American history, how it relates to the Black diaspora and these types of things. It's just important that we understand who and where we are and move forward.
I agree. Well, brother, I appreciate you coming on. It's always a pleasure. I'm going to have you back on sometime this week. So just to let you know.
Listen, thank you so much, man. Listen, enjoy your Sunday.
You too.
Take care.
All right. Peace. All right, everybody. Thank you for joining us. Search for Uhuru. If you're new to the platform, please like, share, and subscribe. Also, make sure you go to searchforuhuru.com. Go to amazon.com. Search your name, Dinus Amir. Please buy a book. Also, go to dinusamir.com. Also, make sure you go to search for Uhuru on Instagram, Snapchat, Twitter, and Facebook. Please like, share, subscribe. Please follow and subscribe here on the YouTube platform. So I will be back on later on today. So everybody, thank you for joining us. Till next time, peace.